Okay, I'd like to start off our discussion of civilization with two general principles of civilization. Now, just a reminder of what civilization means. That word civilization in the context of the study of the humanities refers to societies where we find two things: where people live in cities and where they have access to a written language. Where people live in cities, or maybe if they don't live in cities, then at least the city is important to them as an economic center, a political center, a judicial center, a military center. Somebody might live out in the countryside far away from the cities where they grow their crops, but the city is where they go to sell their crops. So somehow the city is important to them. Places where people live in cities are where the city is important to them and where they at least have access to a written language. Maybe not everybody knows how to read and write, but somebody in town knows how to read and write. There's at least access to a written language. Remember, these two things, cities and written languages, are what distinguish civilizations from other types of societies. Well, I've already mentioned that to you. That's why you see civilization in brackets there. But just keep in mind the definition of civilization. That will help you later on in the course. But I want to start off with two general principles of civilization. And the first general principle of civilization is that in the ancient world, civilizations tended to develop alongside major rivers. Now, I can make that a little more strongly to you, a little more forceful to you, and that is that as far as I know, in the ancient world now, civilizations always developed alongside major rivers with only one exception. As far as I know, there's only one exception to that general principle, that civilizations in the ancient world now tended to develop alongside major rivers. We'll get to the exception when we get to it. Right now I want to establish a general principle. And the general principle is that in the ancient world, civilizations tended to develop alongside major rivers. There's only one exception that I know of. Now, this is a pretty interesting and a pretty strong correlation. I mean, when it comes to time to building cities in the ancient world, they tended to build cities alongside major rivers. Now, in a world history course, we might spend maybe 30 minutes talking about why that might be the case. I mean, if you're building your city, why would you want to build your city next to a major river? But for us in this course, I'll keep things short and just tell you. The first thing that comes to mind, the most obvious reason why you would want to build a city next to a major river, well, that's the best reason, and that is to get access to fresh water. First of all, fresh water to drink, and then fresh water to water your crops and animals with. Yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind. It's the most obvious, and yeah, that's the number one reason, to get access to fresh water. The center of life in what's called a riverine civilization. That word riverine is a word that refers to civilizations which are built alongside major rivers. You see the word river in riverine. The center of life in a riverine civilization was an irrigation system. And at some point you've studied irrigation systems in a world history course in middle school or something. A series of canals and ditches that carry water away from the river out to where people actually live, so that they can, number one, drink the water, and then use the water to water their crops and animals with. The irrigation system, you see, is the center of life in the riverine civilization, because that's what people depend on to get their water. And, well, there's some other benefits to building a city next to a major river. For example, once you've built that irrigation system, then you've essentially built the roads for your city. You just use the irrigation ditches and the canals for the roads for the city. As it turns out, it's easier to move heavy stuff over water than it is over land. You just pick up the heavy stuff, put it on a raft, float it up or downstream, whichever way you're going, and then lift it off the raft instead of carrying the heavy stuff over land. Okay, it's just easier, more efficient, more effective to carry heavy stuff over water. So once you've built the irrigation system, you've also constructed the streets for the city, so you've killed two birds with one stone there. There's a bunch of other reasons as well. Fish live in the irrigation ditches, and so you've got an access to a supply of food, especially protein, that you wouldn't otherwise have if you didn't have your irrigation ditches. If you build your city next to a major river, then you obviously can't be attacked by land on at least one side of your river. On one side of your city. So there's a defensive reason. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why you would want to build a city next to a major river. But number one on the list, the most obvious reason, is the best reason, and that is to get access to fresh water. That's the first general principle of civilization. that in the ancient world, civilizations tended to develop alongside major rivers. The second general principle is that with no exception that I know of, in the ancient world, every riverine civilization developed what you and I would call a dictatorship. Now, we might have different names for the different dictators in different riverine civilizations around the world. We might talk about the pharaoh in Egypt, or the king in Mesopotamia, or the emperor in China, or whatever. But whatever different names we might give to the dictator, if you or I wandered into a riverine civilization in the ancient world, then we'd figure out pretty fast that we were living in what you and I would call a dictatorship, where one person, or at best a handful of people, have complete power over society. And that's another interesting correlation. You know, every riverine civilization, with no exceptions that I know of, develops what you and I would readily recognize as a dictatorship. Well, in a world history course, we would spend some time talking about why that would be the case. I mean, what's the connection? Think about it. What's the connection between building your city next to a river and ending up with a dictatorship? River, dictatorship. There doesn't seem to be much of a connection, but there is one. And here's the connection. In every riverine civilization, remember, the center of life in the riverine civilization centers on the irrigation system. Everybody relies on the irrigation system for water. And in every riverine civilization, somebody figured out, hey, if I get control of the water supply, everybody's going to do what I tell them to do. The key to being a successful dictator, and we're going to come across this idea several times in the course, the key to being a successful dictator is to get control of something everybody needs to have to survive. And when you think about it, there's not much on that list. I mean, there's a long list of things that are nice to have, okay? But if you think about things that everybody needs to have to survive, well, there's not much. I mean, there's all kinds of things that individual people might need to survive. I mean, if you fall out of an airplane, you might need a parachute to survive. But most of us are going to make it through life just fine, never having strapped on a parachute. But if you think about what everybody needs to have to survive, there's not much on the list. But water's on the list. If you don't get water in 3 days, you're dead. Air is on the list. You have to have air to survive. Everybody needs to have air to survive, or you're dead in a few minutes. Food. You can go for quite a long time without food, but at some point, if you don't get food, you're going to die. Or, well, I guess not every day, but at some point, healthcare, because you'll be laying on the ground having a heart attack, and if nobody gives you CPR, you're going to die. It's going to happen to everybody. And, I mean, when you think about it, there's not much on the list, you know, of things that everybody needs to have to survive, but water's on the list. And in every riverine civilization, somebody figured out, if I get control of the water supply, everybody's going to do what I tell them to do. And very quickly we see the development of what you and I would recognize as dictatorships. Well, if you keep these general principles in mind a little bit this week and even more so next week, I think things will make an awful lot more sense to you. These are two good general principles of civilization to keep in mind.